"You there, be quick with the drinks. Waiter, we don't have all day." The insult landed like a slap across the garden air, sharp enough to cut through the string quartet's music. Madison Clark, blonde bun, champagne satin gown plunging low across her chest, diamonds glittering in the afternoon sun, smirked as she raised her voice high enough for every guest to hear. She didn't stumble. She didn't whisper. This wasn't a mistake. It was theater. Gasps fluttered through the white-canopied garden. A few chuckles followed, the kind that sliced deeper than the words themselves. Eleanor Pierce, wife of a senator, threw back her head and laughed, like it was the wittiest thing she'd ever heard. Two men near the marble fountain smirked, glancing at one another. Even the quartet faltered, bows trembling mid-string. At the center of it all stood David Langston, 6'2", broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed in a tailored ivory linen suit, his tie, satin silver, his watch, Patek Philippe, understated, deadly precise. His shoes, black Oxford, polished to a mirror's edge. Everything about him spoke of quiet elegance, but in his hand was the single detail Madison needed. A glass of champagne, held for a friend. That was all it took for her to label him. Not a guest, not an equal, a waiter. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to David. Madison wasn't done. She leaned closer, voice dripping venom masked as charm. Honestly, some people think money buys them a seat here. But class? She let her eyes travel down his suit, pausing long enough to sting. That can't be bought. Laughter erupted again. Eleanor joined in, calling out, "At least serve us right, boy." Her words floated across the garden like poisoned perfume. A few guests turned away, unwilling to interfere, their silence more damning than their laughter. David didn't flinch. He didn't move. His gaze remained steady, locked on Madison, unreadable. To the untrained eye, he seemed passive. To those who knew better, his silence was the loudest thing in the garden. The irony of it all nearly amused him. Around him, wealth dripped from every surface, roses imported from Florence, linens pressed with gold embroidery, crystal flutes catching sunlight like prisms. A stage for power. A playground for privilege. And here he was, the man who would soon own the very ground they stood on, being mistaken for the help. It wasn't the first time. 20 years earlier, fresh out of grad school, he had walked into a gala with a thrift store suit and a binder full of pitches. A man in velvet shoved an empty glass into his hand. "Top this up, boy," he'd said. That humiliation had burned, then hardened. It never left. It became fuel. Now, decades later, the cycle repeated. Different faces. Same script. But the ending would be his to write. David adjusted his tie, calm, measured. The garden quieted slightly, guests waiting for him to break. But he didn't. He lifted the champagne glass, not as a servant, not in surrender, but with deliberate grace. Then he set it down on a passing tray, and straightened once more. Silence rippled outward. Some saw weakness, others saw a storm. Madison saw neither. She preened, mistaking his quiet for compliance. To her, this was victory. To him, it was positioning, because David Langston had no need to raise his voice. His silence was sharper than any blade. His patience, more dangerous than her taunts. And Madison Clark, in all her satin and arrogance, didn't realize she had just signed the opening line of her own downfall. Time was ticking. And the garden would soon belong to him. David didn't move. Not when Eleanor laughed. Not when Madison's friends snickered behind jeweled fingers. Not when the word boy hung in the air like a whip. He simply straightened his tie, the faintest adjustment, and let the silence stretch. That silence unnerved more than anger ever could. Madison mistook it for weakness. She tilted her head, eyes glinting with satisfaction. "See? Not even a word. That's what I thought." She turned half her body toward Eleanor, as if to invite applause. "And she got it." Eleanor chuckled again, her pearls rattling against her chest. But at the edge of the crowd, not everyone was laughing. Julian Cross, 30 years old, banker in a pale tux, leaned forward, His voice cut sharper than the quartet's strings. "That's not a waiter. He's a guest. Show some respect." Head swiveled. Madison blinked. Then the smirk returned, wider than before. "A guest? In that suit?" She let the words drip slow, scanning David's ivory jacket as if it were a costume. "Please." A ripple of unease moved through the garden. Some guests glanced at David more carefully now. They saw the tailoring, the subtle watch, the shoes polished like glass. This wasn't a rented tux. This wasn't knockoff class. But still skin and prejudice spoke louder than fabric. David's eyes shifted briefly toward Julian, an almost imperceptible nod. Not gratitude. Acknowledgement. Then his gaze returned to Madison, steady, unreadable. He remembered another night years ago, 22, fresh out of grad school. He had walked into a hotel gala with nothing but a second-hand suit and a folder of pitches. He had been mistaken for staff then, too. Someone shoved an empty glass at him and ordered, "Top this up." He had taken that sting home, let it burn, and used it to fuel every late-night deal, every acquisition, every ruthless climb. That humiliation had turned into empire, and now, here it was again. Different garden, same script. Sophia Mwyn, camera in hand, shifted quietly at the perimeter. Her lens tilted, locking onto Madison's sneer. She tapped record. The faint red light blinked to life. She wasn't sure yet why she filmed, only that something about David's stillness told her this moment mattered. Julian tried once more. "Seriously, Madison, enough. You're embarrassing yourself." But Madison laughed, tossing her golden bun back. "Embarrassing myself? Darling, I'm saving this event from pretenders." She turned toward David again, lowering her voice just enough to sting. "Don't get too comfortable, waiter. The real guests notice everything." David exhaled, slow, almost inaudible. His chest rose, then settled. Inside, his mind was already moving, pieces aligning, signals ready. From across the lawn, his assistant Carla caught his eye. One subtle nod. Her phone was already in her hand. The champagne glass had been an accident. Madison's insult had been predictable. But what came next that would not be an accident, because David Langston was no stranger to humiliation. He had been forged in it. And he knew better than anyone. Humiliation is only power if you accept it. He never did. He never would. Madison smiled, thinking she had won the moment. She didn't realize she had just triggered the storm, and storms never announce themselves with thunder first. They begin with silence. The garden wasn't silent anymore. It buzzed soft, sharp, ugly. A cluster of women near the fountain whispered behind jeweled hands, their eyes darting to David, then back to Madison as if waiting for her cue. One man in a navy blazer muttered, "This is awkward," yet he didn't step in. He sipped his wine instead, choosing comfort over conscience. Eleanor Pierce leaned on her cane and smirked. "Darling, you're too kind," she told Madison. "Events like these don't need distractions." Her voice carried a stamp of approval for the insult already hanging in the air. David remained still, his presence somehow growing heavier with every second he refused to break. But to Madison, his silence was submission. She thrived in it. "Look at him," she said, louder now, ensuring the far tables heard. Not a word, not a protest, exactly what I'd expect. She lifted her champagne, a toast to her own cruelty. A few nervous chuckles followed. No one corrected her. Sophia Mwyn's camera didn't waver. Her fingers stayed pressed to record, the faint hum of focus locking in on Madison's smirk. She caught Eleanor's laugh. She caught the hesitant chuckles. She caught every ugly second. Julian Cross's jaw tightened. "Enough," he said again, but softer this time, drowned out by the chatter. His protest felt small against the tide of indifference. Madison turned her eyes back to David, savoring his silence. "See? He knows his place." The phrase hit harder than the first insult. A wave of discomfort rolled through the garden, but still no one moved. David didn't blink. Didn't shift. Only exhaled, slow and steady, as though he had seen this scene play out 1,000 times before. And in truth, he had. What no one realized was that his silence wasn't retreat. It was calculation, and soon, the very crowd laughing at him would remember this moment not as Madison's victory, but as the instant before everything changed. Julian Cross couldn't take it anymore. He pushed his chair back, the scrape of wood on marble cutting through the chatter. Eyes turned toward him, not because anyone expected a young banker to change the mood, but because his defiance broke the polished rhythm of the afternoon. "That's enough, Madison," he said, louder this time, voice carrying across the garden. "You don't speak to a guest like that." The laughter wavered. A few chuckles died in throats. But Madison, perfectly poised, didn't miss a beat. She angled her body toward Julian, hand on her hip, diamonds catching sunlight. "Oh, relax. It's a party. We're all just having fun." Her smirk widened. "Unless you actually believe he belongs here?" She tilted her head toward David, making him an exhibit instead of a man. Gasps rose. Some guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Julian's jaw tightened. "I believe in basic respect." Madison laughed, a high, cutting sound. "Respect is earned, darling. And I don't see it." The words hung like smoke. Eleanor Pierce clapped slowly, approving, while Richard and Laura Sterling exchanged uneasy glances, caught between loyalty to their peers and the discomfort brewing in their stomachs. David still hadn't moved. His silence had become an immovable wall. Every insult hurled at him seemed to splinter against it, shattering before it ever reached him. That silence spoke louder than anything. Madison said it unsettled the crowd in ways they couldn't name. Sophia Nguyen adjusted her camera angle, zooming slightly closer. Her lens captured Julian's anger, Madison's smirk, Eleanor's smug approval. She knew what she was recording wasn't just gossip, it was evidence. Julian turned back to David. "Say something," he urged, desperation leaking into his tone. "You don't have to take this." But David only lifted his gaze. Steady. Calm. Unshaken. And then he spoke not to Madison. Not to Julian, but to the space between them. "I've seen this before," he said quietly, his voice low but clear enough to carry. Different faces. Same energy. The crowd froze. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it carried a weight that settled over the garden like an unexpected storm cloud. Madison blinked, caught off guard for the first time. Then she recovered, snapping back. "And what energy is that?" Being out of place. David didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence after those words was answer enough. A ripple moved through the crowd. For the first time, doubt began to fracture the smug certainty. The laughter didn't come as quickly. The chuckles turned nervous. The spell Madison had cast was beginning to crack, and in that tiny fracture, power shifted, just a little, but enough to matter. Sophia Nguyen's hands were steady, steadier than her heartbeat. Through her lens, the garden looked different, sharper, harsher. Every smirk was captured, every laugh frozen in digital memory. Every flicker of arrogance sealed into pixels. She had started recording out of instinct, but now she knew. This wasn't just documentation, it was accountability. Her camera followed Madison as the blonde adjusted her satin gown, sipping champagne like she had already won. Madison basked in the chuckles that still lingered, mistaking nervous laughter for applause. But Sophia's lens didn't lie. The recording caught the hesitation to the guests who shifted uncomfortably, the ones who looked away, the tightness in Julian's jaw. The footage didn't just show cruelty. It showed complicity. Madison leaned closer to David again, her smile dripping with condescension. "See how quiet he is. That's the thing about some people, they always know when they're out of place." Sophia zoomed in, the red light steady. She caught David's face perfectly. Calm, unflinching, almost serene. It was the face of someone who had heard this line before, 1,000 times, and no longer gave it the power to cut. Across the garden, another figure was moving just as quietly. Carla Evans, dressed in a tailored navy dress, heels clicking softly against the marble path, lifted her phone. No one noticed her slip away toward the edge of the lawn, where the crowd thinned. Her voice was low when she spoke into her earpiece. "It's happening," Carla said, eyes never leaving her boss. "Prepare the contract. Keep the line open." On the other end, a voice responded crisply, "Standing by." David hadn't signaled openly. He didn't need to. Carla had worked beside him long enough to read silence like a language. She knew this looked calm on the surface, storm beneath, and storms required preparation. Back at the tables, Julian clenched his fists. "You think humiliating him makes you powerful?" He snapped at Madison. She rolled her eyes, raising her glass again. "No, darling. Recognizing who belongs and who doesn't, that's power." The words drifted across the lawn, sharper than the clink of crystal. A few guests murmured, some raised brows, others exchanged uneasy glances. The arrogance was beginning to sound less like banter, and more like poison. Sophia's lens drank it all in. Every word, every sneer. Her gut told her this footage would matter later. She didn't know how. She just knew that silence paired with evidence was more dangerous than shouting. David still hadn't spoken again. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, eyes steady, suit gleaming under the midday sun. The picture of composure. The picture of control. And while Madison performed for the crowd, Sophia's camera and Carla's phone were recording the truth. Two silent women, unnoticed by most, had just turned the balance of the garden. They were the witnesses. They were the preparation, and without anyone realizing it, the downfall had already begun. Madison Clark lifted her glass high, sunlight spilling off the rim like liquid fire. Her voice carried clear across the garden. Louder than the quartet, sharper than the whispers. "Do you see?" she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd before landing squarely back on David. "Not a word, not a protest. Exactly what I said. He knows his place." The laughter that followed was thinner this time, scattered, almost brittle. But it was there, polite chuckles, nervous smirks, the sound of privilege trying to hold its ground. Eleanor Pierce clapped her jeweled hands once, approving, pearls bouncing against her throat. "Well said," she chimed, as if Madison had delivered a public service instead of an insult. David's stillness was a weight pressing on the entire lawn. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His silence was starting to feel less like surrender and more like defiance, though Madison was too caught up in her own performance to notice. She stepped closer, satin gown brushing against his suit, and tilted her head. "Here's the truth," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sting but loud enough for the closest tables to hear. "Money can buy you a ticket through the gates, but it can't buy you class. And it will never buy you the right to stand here as an equal." The words landed heavy. Gasps fluttered from a few corners. One woman in pastel pink pressed her lips tight, uncomfortable but silent. A man in a gray suit shifted in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks as if the movement could distract from the ugliness in the air. Julian Cross took a step forward. "That's it," he snapped. "You've crossed the line." His face was flushed, his hands clenched. "This isn't banter anymore, it's disgusting." But Madison only smiled, unbothered. She leaned back slightly, champagne still poised, her blonde bun glinting like a crown in the sunlight. "Darling, you're young. You don't understand how these circles work. Some of us were born to belong." Her gaze slid back to David. "And some of us were born to serve." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable anymore. It was suffocating. Even the quartet faltered again, notes breaking like glass underfoot. Sophia Wynn's camera caught everything: the sneer, the arrogance, the crowd's uneasy shift. Through her lens, Madison's cruelty looked uglier, starker, stripped of its glamour. And beside her, a guest whispered under their breath, "This will not age well." Across the lawn, Carla Evans lowered her phone, her eyes narrowing. She had just received confirmation. The paperwork was ready. All it would take was a single word from David. But David gave none. Not yet. He stood rooted, watching Madison, letting her sink deeper into the hole she was digging with every word. His silence wasn't compliance, it was strategy. And as Madison raised her glass again, smiling as if she'd conquered the afternoon, she had no idea she was standing on the edge of her own undoing. The cruelty had peaked. The crowd had felt it. The cracks were spreading, and David Langston hadn't even lifted his voice. The air in the garden had shifted. What had started as laughter now carried the brittle edge of unease. Guests weren't smiling as freely. Their chuckles sounded hollow, like glass about to crack. And through it all, David Langston remained perfectly still. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't raised a hand. He simply stood there, tall in his ivory linen suit, his eyes steady, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. The sun caught on his watch, glinting once, a reminder that what Madison mistook for simplicity was precision. Silence. That was his answer. And silence carried further than words. Madison shifted on her heels, for the first time catching the weight of stares that weren't as supportive as before. She forced a laugh, raising her glass once more. "Oh, don't get so serious, everyone. It's a party, can't you take a joke?" But her voice was too loud, too sharp. The confidence had a crack. Julian Cross stepped closer to David, almost protective now. "You don't have to take this," he muttered again, his voice tight. David's gaze flicked toward him, calm, steady, unreadable. Then back to Madison. He didn't say a word. The lack of response unsettled her more than if he'd shouted. She wanted noise. She wanted him to break, to prove her point. But he gave her nothing. Eleanor Pierce tried to salvage it, her pearls swaying as she leaned forward. "Ignore him, Madison. He's beneath this conversation." But even Eleanor's words sounded strained, thinner than before. A man at the next table frowned openly, his wife tugging at his sleeve as if to warn him not to get involved. Sophia Nguyen's lens tightened, capturing the way David's silence filled the lawn. Through her viewfinder, the contrast was stark. Madison, restless, clutching her glass too tightly, her smirk slipping. David, unmoved, controlled, power radiating without a word. And across the lawn, Carla Evans lingered near the edge of the crowd, phone in hand, her eyes locked on her boss. She saw what no one else did. That silence wasn't hesitation. It was strategy, a signal, the kind of pause that comes before a verdict. Madison tried again, stepping forward, her heels clicking sharp against marble. "What's wrong?" she taunted, louder now. "Cat got your tongue." She gestured toward the guests. "See, he doesn't deny it. He knows exactly where he stands." But this time, the laughter didn't follow. Instead, there was a ripple of whispers, uncertain, questioning. A woman near the fountain murmured, "Why isn't he reacting?" Another man whispered back, "Because he doesn't have to." Madison blinked. For the first time, the script wasn't going her way. David let the silence stretch longer, heavier. He exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't fear. It was command. And in that stillness, the crowd began to sense the truth. The man Madison mocked wasn't powerless. He was patient, and patience in the right hands is the sharpest blade of all. Carla Evans had been waiting for this moment. She stood near the garden's edge, the shade of an olive tree breaking across her navy dress, her phone pressed discreetly to her ear. From where she stood, she could see everything: Madison's mocking grin, Eleanor's pearl-clad approval, the crowd's shifting discomfort. And David, unflinching, calm as stone. "It's time," she whispered. On the other end, a voice responded crisply. "Documents are in place. Do you want us to proceed?" Carla's eyes flicked back to David. He hadn't looked at her, hadn't given the smallest signal. But she knew him. She'd worked beside him long enough to read silence like a language. And right now, his silence screamed louder than orders ever could. "Yes," she said softly. "Proceed. But hold final authorization until he gives it." She slipped the phone back into her clutch, expression smooth, controlled. To the unknowing eye, she was just another guest checking her messages. But beneath that calm, the machinery of empire had just shifted gears. Back in the center of the lawn, Madison pressed her advantage, oblivious. She circled David like a predator savoring the hunt, her glass of champagne swinging dangerously close to spilling. "Why so quiet?" she pressed, her tone sharp, sugar laced with venom. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you know deep down this isn't your world." A few scattered laughs followed, but weaker this time, like embers losing flame. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. One woman tugged at her husband's sleeve and whispered, "This feels wrong." He nodded, but neither spoke louder. Julian Cross clenched his fists again, stepping forward. "You don't even realize who you're talking to," Madison scoffed. "Oh, spare me. I know exactly who I'm talking to, a man out of place, clinging to a ticket money can buy but class never will. Her words hung heavy, dripping poison into the garden air. Sophia Wynn's camera caught every flicker. Through her lens, the scene looked almost surreal. Madison glowing in sunlight, her beauty wrapped around cruelty. David standing like a monument, carved from silence and patience. The crowd split between discomfort and complicity. She whispered under her breath, "People need to see this." Behind her, two guests glanced at the red recording light and murmured. One muttered, "She shouldn't be saying that." Another whispered back, "Don't get involved." But involvement was no longer optional. The moment had already taken on a life of its own. Madison, still circling, tilted her head. "Say something," she demanded. "Defend yourself. Or maybe you can't, because you know I'm right." David didn't move. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. His silence wasn't weakness, it was verdict. And just beyond the laughter, just beyond Madison's cruel smile, the wheels of something far larger had already been set in motion. Carla's call had lit the fuse. The crowd didn't know it yet. Madison certainly didn't. But before the afternoon ended, every guest on that lawn would realize the truth. This wasn't David Langston's humiliation. It was Madison Clark's undoing. Whispers rippled through the garden like a sudden draft of wind. They began at the edges, low and uncertain, then spread inward. "Isn't that David Langston?" one man murmured, leaning toward his wife. She frowned. "It can't be. He wouldn't be here alone. He wouldn't." She paused, eyes scanning his immaculate suit, the watch glinting on his wrist, the posture that screamed authority even in silence. Her voice faltered. "Would he?" Across the lawn, another guest whispered, "I've seen him before. At the Meridian Conference. That's him. I'm sure of it." The ripple grew. Guests started exchanging cautious looks, their confidence in Madison's narrative cracking, but Madison herself didn't notice. Or maybe she did and doubled down to drown it out. She lifted her chin, her glass gleaming in the sun. "Look at him," she announced, her tone sharp, triumphant. "So quiet, so still. That's not grace, it's submission. And he knows it." The laughter that followed was thin, forced, more like echoes than sound. A young woman near the fountain pressed her lips together, her gaze flicking between Madison and David. Finally she whispered, "Why does this feel wrong?" Julian Cross heard her. "Because it is." He shot back, louder this time, so more guests would hear. He gestured at David, at the calm towering figure in the center of the humiliation. "Look at him. Does he look like someone begging for approval? Or does he look like someone letting her bury herself?" A hush spread. More eyes turned, really turned, taking David in properly for the first time. The fit of his suit, the way he wore silence like armor, the way he didn't break under ridicule. Eleanor Pierce bristled, sensing the shift. She forced a laugh, pearls rattling against her chest. "Don't be ridiculous. He's no one." Madison's right. This is a party, not a boardroom. But even her voice wavered, as if she were trying to convince herself. Sophia Wynn's camera caught it all, the cracks in the crowd's certainty, the hesitation in their eyes, the way silence spread not just from David but from the people around him. She zoomed in on Madison's face. The smirk was still there, but tighter now, edges brittle. The performance was faltering. Near the edge of the garden, Carla Evans glanced at her phone again. A single message flashed across the screen. "Contracts confirmed. Awaiting your word." She looked back to David, still silent, still waiting. Madison stepped closer once more, heels clicking sharp against the marble path. "You think silence protects you? It doesn't. It only proves me right." She laughed, the sound brittle now. "You'll never belong. Not here. Not with us." But the crowd no longer laughed with her. Some lowered their eyes. Others folded their arms. A man near the front muttered, "Then why does he look more like he belongs than anyone else here?" For the first time, Madison's smirk flickered, and the crowd, once united in her arrogance, was beginning to split wide open. The tension had become unbearable, like strings pulled too tight on a violin, ready to snap. Whispers hummed across the garden, eyes flicking between David's calm frame and Madison's smug posture. And then Sophia Wynn stepped forward. Her camera was still raised, the red recording light blinking steadily. She took a breath, steadying herself, then let her voice rise above the murmurs. "I recorded everything," she said, clear and firm. The words landed like a thunderclap. Heads turned. A dozen conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even the quartet stumbled into silence. Madison blinked, caught off guard. Then she scoffed, tossing her head back. "So what? Nobody cares about your little camera, sweetheart. This is a private event." But her voice was sharper than before, the edges of arrogance beginning to fray. Sophia didn't lower the lens. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on Madison. "Number. What people care about is the way you just humiliated him. Every insult. Every word. And I have it all." Gasps rippled. A woman near the back whispered, "She filmed it?" Another man muttered, "This could ruin reputations." Julian's chest lifted, relief breaking through his frustration. "Show them," he urged Sophia. "Show everyone what really happened." Eleanor Pierce snapped her fan shut, pearls rattling. "Don't be ridiculous. It was harmless banter. Nobody's going to take a silly video seriously." But her voice wavered, betraying her. The crowd had shifted. Where once there was laughter, now there was doubt. And doubt was contagious. Madison's smirk faltered, just slightly. She pointed at Sophia, her voice rising. "Put that away before I have security remove you." But it was the wrong move. Guests exchanged glances, their unease turning into judgment. One man whispered to his wife, "If it's just a joke, why is she so afraid of the recording?" Sophia held her ground, lens steady. "Because she knows it's not a joke." Silence followed, heavier than any insult that had come before. All eyes turned back to Madison. Her cheeks flushed, the champagne glass trembling in her hand. And through it all, David Langston stood unmoved, his calm presence magnified by the chaos swirling around him. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. Others were doing it for him now. Carla Evans, standing at the edge of the lawn, glanced at her phone once more. A new message lit up. "Transfer ready. Awaiting signal." Her lips pressed into a faint smile. The timing was aligning perfectly. Madison tried to laugh again, but it cracked. "You're all overreacting. He's nobody. A waiter with a nice suit. That's all." But the crowd no longer believed her. Their eyes betrayed them, some filled with guilt, some with shame, some with dawning realization. And Sophia, still recording, captured it all. The collapse of arrogance under the weight of truth. The narrative was shifting. Madison's stage was crumbling, and David hadn't spoken a word. The garden had gone quiet. Too quiet. Madison Clark's voice had lost its echo, her arrogance crumbling under the weight of Sophia's camera and the crowd's shifting eyes. The whispers were no longer about David's supposed place, they were about her cruelty, her fear, her cracks showing in the afternoon sun. And through it all, David Langston still hadn't spoken. Until now, he drew a breath, deep and steady, the sound carrying farther than the quartet ever had. His eyes swept the garden, not just at Madison, but at every guest who had laughed, who had looked away, who had done nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, but carried with the authority of a verdict. "You spoke to me as if I didn't belong here," he said, "as if my silence meant weakness. But silence," he paused, letting the air itself tighten, "isn't absence, it's patience." A ripple moved through the crowd. No one laughed now, no one dared. David continued, his voice steady, resonant. "You called me a waiter. You told me I was out of place. But here's the truth: you never considered this place you mocked me in. This garden. This ballroom you think you own with your laughter." He turned slightly, his gaze locking on Madison, who froze mid-smirk. "It belongs to me. As of tonight, this entire venue is mine." Gasps erupted. Glasses clinked as hands trembled. One man whispered, "He bought it?" Another clutched his chest, eyes wide. Madison blinked rapidly, her glass lowering without her realizing it. What are you talking about?" Her voice cracked for the first time all afternoon. From the edge of the lawn, Carla Evans stepped forward, phone in hand, folder tucked under her arm. Calm, efficient, unstoppable. She handed David a sleek leather portfolio. Already stamped, already signed. David opened it slowly, deliberately, as if giving every guest time to see. The contracts were finalized this morning. The transfer of ownership completed just minutes ago. He closed the folder with a soft snap that echoed like a gavel. So when you said I don't belong here, you weren't just wrong. His eyes locked on Madison. You were standing in my house. The crowd erupted not with laughter, not with whispers, but with the stunned silence of realization. Julian Cross's lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile. Sophia's camera caught everything the moment of power shifting, the instant the balance snapped. Madison stumbled back a step, her satin gown catching against the marble path. That's not possible, you can't. But her protest died as Carla spoke, crisp and precise. Mr. Langston is now the sole owner of this estate and venue, effective immediately. Eleanor Pierce's fan slipped from her hand, clattering onto the tiles. Richard Sterling muttered, "Good God," under his breath. Guests shifted uncomfortably, shame burning in their eyes as they realized the truth. They hadn't just mocked a man, they had mocked the man who owned the very ground beneath their feet. David didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His voice remained calm, almost cold. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem was how you treated someone you thought didn't matter. His words cut sharper than Madison's insults ever had. Because they weren't just about him, they were about all of them. Madison stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. For the first time that afternoon, she looked small. And David Langston. He hadn't raised his voice once. Yet with a few quiet words, he had shifted the weight of an entire world. The humiliation was no longer his. It was hers. The garden had never been this quiet. No string music. No laughter. Only the faint trickle of the marble fountain and the weight of collective shame pressing down on every guest present. Madison Clark stood frozen, champagne glass, slipping slightly in her trembling grip. Her satin gown shimmered in the daylight, but all the shine had drained from her face. The smirk was gone. The arrogance evaporated. She looked small. David Langston closed the leather folder Carla had handed him, the sound sharp in the silence. He didn't look at Madison again. She had already undone herself. Instead, he let his gaze sweep across the crowd, the same crowd that had chuckled, whispered, and looked away. Their faces now carried a different story. Guilt, regret, even admiration. No one dared laugh anymore. No one dared call him waiter again. Julian Cross broke the silence first. He lifted his glass, voice steady. To dignity. It was simple, but powerful. A ripple of agreement followed, hesitant at first, then growing louder as more guests raised their glasses. Not for Madison, not for Eleanor. For him. For the man who hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to demand. He had simply revealed the truth. David gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Nothing more. He didn't bask in it. He didn't need to. Madison finally found her voice, but it was weak, cracked. You set me up. David turned his eyes to her once more, calm, steady. You set yourself up. I just let the truth arrive. The words landed heavier than any insult she had thrown. Madison's shoulders slumped, her glass lowering as if even gravity had turned against her. Sophia Nguyen lowered her camera, heart still racing. She knew she had captured history in motion, a moment people would replay not for entertainment, but for meaning. Quiet justice, caught in the lens. Carla stepped back to her place, her role complete, silent and efficient as always. David adjusted his tie, smooth and unhurried, then turned toward the garden gates. He didn't linger. He didn't celebrate. His steps were calm, precise, each one echoing with the authority of a man who had nothing left to prove. Guests parted as he passed, their silence filled not with contempt but with respect. Even those who had mocked him earlier lowered their eyes, some in shame, some in awe. At the edge of the lawn, sunlight poured across his shoulders as he walked away, leaving the laughter, the whispers, the humiliation behind. The garden remained still, the weight of his words hanging like a verdict carved into stone. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem was how you treated someone you thought didn't matter. And in that silence, justice was complete. David Langston never raised his voice. He didn't need to, because true power doesn't shout. It simply exists and makes the world fall quiet.